Welcome everybody to the 26th technical session of the World University Summit. We are going to have the session Voices from the Ground, Reimagination of Policy and Regulations for Universities in Times of Crisis. My name is Sreejith SG. I'm the Executive Dean of Jindal Global Law School, and I'll be the moderator of this session. I have 5 distinguished speakers for this extremely imaginative and extraordinary session, which talks about regulations and policies and their impact thereof during the COVID-19 times. We have with us Professor Dr. Sandeep Gopalan, Vice Chancellor, Carolina University, United States, Professor Dr. Marcelo Knobel, former Rector, University of Campinas, Brazil, Professor Dr. Joana, Angélica, Guimarães, Rector, Universidade Federal do Sul na Bahia, Brazil, Professor Dr. Carolina Johnson, Registrar, University of Pretoria, South Africa, and Lieutenant General Dr. M.D. Venkatesh, Vice Chancellor, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, Karnataka, India. I take this opportunity to welcome every distinguished speaker and everybody who's connected to us through YouTube and our Facebook channel to this 26th technical session, Voices from the Ground, Reimagination of Policy and Regulations for Universities in Times of Crisis. As I've mentioned, this session is extraordinary because during the pandemic, in a never-before manner, policies and regulations have come to the forefront, which used to be a subconscious influence in our daily lives. Now they have become routine subject matter of deliberation and consultation. We have been a year into the pandemic. It changed our lives in many ways. On the higher education front, when the pandemic struck, it disrupted many processes, including admissions, teaching, research, mobility, international collaborations, career services, and community outreach. This disruption has further ruptured many channels and networks of interaction, learning, and resource mobilization. As states adopted the policy of closure as a public health response to the pandemic, the human social world was literally shut, though temporarily. It was as if we were back to the Eden, laden with the responsibility to reinvent the world. Becoming resilient was the most viable option. However, resilience is not minimum bare survival and sustenance. Resilience is also a retention of our existential aspirations and the motivations which propelled us all throughout, such that we not only stay afloat, but we swim ahead. Hence, resilience necessitated invoking memory of our foundations, our beginnings, our ontology. Particularly in the context of higher education, our founding philosophies, the collective memory of institutional evolution, and the stories of our progressive development are embedded in institutional policies. Hence, policies became the site of our reinventions. As part of the reinvention, we started with exploring meanings and asking big questions, to the extent of asking, what does higher education signify? What is excellence? What are the social outcomes of our individual and collective efforts? Many of us try to understand the distance between the fallen physical spaces and the new online spatial structures in our search for qualitatively equivalent alternatives to the many practices and processes carried out in physical spaces until then. While there has been a revolution of invention, we should also be self-reflecting on how much we have been able to adhere to our core values like equal access, equal opportunity, and equal distribution, and our core institutional values like perseverance, freedom, integrity, discipline, financial stability, and pursuit of excellence. This distinguished panel will deliberate on many of the above said and related considerations, including ways and means of addressing continuing challenges, closing gaps and bridging divides, reducing vulnerabilities, building competencies, and further policy and regulatory adaptations. This panel will particularly focus on the role played by policies and regulations in the university's efforts at resilience building. I've formulated my questions in a little bit conceptual way so that there is a certain openness to it. The very idea is that our distinguished speakers could respond to these conceptual questions based on their own experiments and experiences so that our audience get a broad spectrum of experience. My first question, it primarily focuses on the normative character of policies and regulations. The typical institutional response chain to the COVID-19 pandemic has been that of an initial shock, then an assessment of our competencies, followed by a response in the spirit of experimentation and innovation. Policies, which until then were our subconscious driving force, suddenly became the subject matter of deliberation, to the extent of them becoming the site of reconstruction. While the malleability of policies helped us in the larger institutional reorganization, the rigidity of regulations was somewhat challenging. This was concerning, especially given the importance of regulations in setting minimum standards of function and outcomes for universities. This challenge was exacerbated by the slow response from regulatory bodies. At that juncture, a year back, when COVID struck us, what formula helped your institution balance policies and regulation? Let me probably, I'd like to start with Professor Luz.
Well, we have, after we have shifted from the physical classroom to the remote teaching format, our first challenge was how to deal with our regulation, as well as taking into account the conditions of both teachers and students in the process. So this was a great concern. Our greatest challenge was to promote viable and safe working and pedagogical conditions to both students and teachers in order to maintain the quality in the educational process. We had to train those professors without the technical knowledge for remote online teaching, as well figuring out not only how to regularly deliver to our students rich virtual learning experience, but we also had to keep in mind those many students without the very basic conditions to participate in this virtual process, virtual experience, hardware, softwares, and viable internet connections. The high number of students excluded from online access due to the lack of computers or access to the internet, as well as the lack of adequate conditions for studying home, all that aggravated by the hard reality of the poor socioeconomic situation of most Brazilian families, highlighting the dimension of and complexity of the problem. So we had this big problem, a huge problem in our hands, and we found ways to lend our students the necessary equipment and to facilitate connectivity so they could participate in online class and develop their activities. In addition, we have adapted the academic calendar, thus allowing professors to best deliver their classes. These actions reduced the anxiety caused by the pandemic situation. Also, the psychological support for both students and faculty was one of our biggest concerns. Some students even dropped in their classes because the situation was caused because the fear about the pandemic, but also many students had to leave the university to work in order to give financial support to their families. Our main role was flexibility. This was what we had in mind. Flexibility was the main thing we should deal with. Another thing that helped us was the support we created through our National Association of Directors of Federal Institutions of Higher Education. This association brings together all 69 Brazilian federal universities. So we discussed the situation of each university in general and the specifics, considering the regional differences given by the size of Brazil, of course. This created an environment of solidarity and support for all of us. So this helped a lot, and we took into account all these questions I put here, and these helped us a lot to make the regulations necessary for the time we were in that moment. That's it.
Thank you, Professor Luz. Indeed, you have rightly pointed out, I think one of the main search at that point was the search of quality within a regime of flexibility, and that flexibility regime was an inevitability at that point. May I now move on to General Venkatesh with the same question, how you have found yourself in the nexus between policy, the softness of the policy, and the hardness of the regulations when the pandemic struck us?
Thank you, Professor Sreejith. I think before I get into my response, I would like to give a small context in which the university is existing. We are in Manipal, which is a small coastal town near Mangalore. It's a district headquarter by itself. And Manipal happens to be one of the largest private universities, grown over now from 1953 till now. It houses, at any given time, when the pandemic struck, we had close to more than 25,000 students on campus with, majority of our programs, more than 60% So 65% of the programs being in the health sciences domain. So that was one issue. And second, university also was hosting one of the largest hospitals in this region, along with 5 other hospitals in the neighboring districts and within the same district. And therefore, we also had the huge social responsibility of providing the healthcare and support to the district administration in terms of tackling this pandemic at a time when everybody was clueless. Everybody was absolutely, when the pandemic hit the unsuspecting world in, say, in India in the early part of March, and the problems were plenty, and the policies were non-existent. In fact, the public health policies had to be reinvented from within whatever information that we got from the ministry and various other health regulatory agencies. In fact, for the entire district, our institution had to provide with not only the regulatory, rather public health infrastructure, public health support, public health policies to tackle with the COVID situation. So this is one issue. Second issue which concerned us was the student demography within the university was something very, very different. We had almost 85% of our student strength who were resident within the university or staying outside the university in the close vicinity of the university. We were dealing with 3 distinct subsets of people. One, residents within the university, a cohort of students who were residents just outside of the university, and also the day scholars who were coming in and out of the university on a daily basis. And this was, again, another issue that the university had to tackle and keep in mind, because keeping the way in which the COVID spread. The third major imperative on the university was to, as Madam mentioned, is about the health and wellness of the people, the faculty, the non-teaching staff, and the student community, and also the community who stays around. In fact, if you see the university town, much of the economy of the town depends on the university. Therefore, we need to keep this community also in mind when we had to do our planning in that sense. So first and foremost priority that the university accorded at that particular time was the health and safety of the students, and also provide the requisite medical support that was required for the community around us and 6 other districts surrounding the Udupi district. That was one part. Second issue was about reallocating resources. Reallocating resources and with regard to basically the health sciences, the hospital, reallocating resources, stopping the non-COVID treatment, which seriously affected the viability of the hospital. Yet we had to do it because we were a responsible institution. And also the demands of I won't say the demand, but the requests of the local administration, the state government, which literally transferred the entire burden of managing the COVID patients to us, both at the primary level, secondary level, and the tertiary level, including running of COVID ICUs with ventilators and other things. That was the first part of it when the first phase of the COVID infection hit us. And then came the lockdown concurrently, which ensured that the large proportion of students continued to stay, and many of them during the break between the lockdown wanted to go back. And the government policies also said that vacate the campuses. This gave us another big problem in terms of ensuring that the students were screened for COVID. There were travel restrictions, international flights was disrupted, the local flights were disrupted. Every state was formulating its own guidelines with regard to entry and exit. So this again, we had to mobilize a lot more organization to support this request, and also ensure that the students reach back safely, and the parental anxiety had to be addressed too. So we had to set up a lot of teams to counsel the parents and also engage the parents and the students. And also a separate organization was set up to deal with the local administration. A separate organization was set up to make the campus safe. And also during the lockdown, the employees were not available at the workplaces. Therefore, it took a lot of effort for all to put all these things together. But as you correctly said, the university's resilience and the institutional memory And the commitment displayed by our faculties, non-teaching staff, and the support that we received from the community has been exemplary. And this was part one of our journey in the phase one of the COVID infection, and where everything was new. Nobody knew what was going to happen, and the instructions were far and in between, and they were really not quite helpful. So we had to take our own decision, deviate from our set policies, and be flexible in our approach, and decentralized decision making. This was a very, very critical thing that we did. And since it's a sprawling campus spread over 1,200 acres, different institutions in different places, hostels in different areas, so we were very consciously decentralized decision making, but yet there was constant monitoring. There were meetings in the morning, meetings in the evening, they were all available. Task force was set for various activities. Standard operating procedures were revisited, redeveloped, and then which strengthened as the COVID period extended. And everybody thought that this would end in 3 months. And we thought that we would be back to normal in the end of 3 months, which hasn't happened after 16 months. And the worst was yet to happen when the phase two ended. Between the phase one and phase two, when we got the students back on campus, students were very enthusiastic, parents were very enthusiastic. We had to reorganize our own structure again in terms of establishing screening centers, fever clinics, isolation areas, quarantine facilities. Of course, we had the advantage having the hospital within our campus. Therefore, for some of those serious patients, we could help them out. And also we had, during the lockdown, also we had to provide transport to the hospital. Hospital could not stop functioning. So we had to, fleet of vehicles had to be arranged so that the healthcare workers could be brought in. And their health and safety was again another issue when vaccination was not available. And it was a critical time, but then the institutional memory, the resilience, the commitment, and the wherewithal of the university to support all these things at the time of distress really helped us to sail through the phase one and the phase two also in a great sense of success. And again, as Madam has put it, instead, other than the administrative aspect, we also had to look at the academic delivery in terms of quickly moving over. What helped us in our university was the level of technology adoption, which has already occurred prior to the COVID. There's a very, very high level of technology adoption, which helped us quickly switch over. But then again, we had to reorient our faculty to online delivery, online evaluation. And again, what Madam brought out was very right. There was a cohort of students who could not benefit from this major change which occurred. And during the lockdown, most of the students had to leave with their bare essentials back to their native places without books, so without other resources. So the university had to look at them, and the faculty had to guide them with terms of availability of online resources. And so it was a difficult period, but the level of adaptation by both the faculty and the students and the support from the parents, and of course the administration helped us through. And today, I think, though we had a stretched academic calendar, we are almost in line so that the student did not lose out on any time. So there were issues of evaluation, which was really a little troubling to us,
Yes.
which we had to realign ourselves and perhaps make a little bit of change, big change, I would say. And this has this has now brought us to a stage that we are seriously looking at revisiting, reviewing our evaluation practices to strengthen the. Are we coming to this question later? Oh.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. But you made a very, very interesting observation here that this gave us an opportunity to see the social context in which our policies operate, which probably, we took it for granted that policies are serving its purpose. So as I've mentioned, they were actually a subconscious guide to us. They were subconscious influences to us. But dramatically, that we lost the homogeneity of the community, the campus community, and we had to reimagine in terms of the social context in which these policies applied. May I now move on to Professor Nicholson with the same question, actually, because we've also felt a density of policies. How much of regulatory aid literally we got at this time when policies were the subject matter of our deliberation or reimagination?
Thank you very much. Yeah, the experience in South Africa, I think, was very similar to the one that has been shared with us by Professor Luz in Brazil. We also have a very demographically diverse student population, and a great many of our students, in fact, rely upon the university for a lot of their support that will normally in a wealthier community from the home environment. So when we were plunged into the situation where our students were compelled to be returned home, a lot of them returned to rural environments, to very underprivileged environments where they had difficulties with connectivity, even with electricity supply. I don't know how aware you are of the electricity problems in South Africa currently, but with load shedding, etc., even students who did have access to internet had difficulties because of lack of electricity supply. And of course, we have very underprivileged students who live in environments where they have no electricity, no internet connectivity. So the universities were compelled to be very innovative in ensuring that they were able to continue to support their students. So as with the other institutions, our first priority was, of course, to develop the necessary programs and policies to ensure the safety of our staff and our students for work and for study. And then our second priority, of course, was to complete the academic year, but ensuring that we maintained the quality of the academic offering, and at the same time facilitated access for students to the offering that we could make available. That meant that we had to move into modes of developing, for example, a laptop loan system where we acquired laptops and distributed them to students who didn't have them. This was supported by tutoring support that was made available, including telephonic tutoring for students who couldn't make use of laptops. We even resorted to sending written materials to students who would not be able to keep up to date with their studies. Our motto at the time was "No student left behind." And of course, we had to then adapt, as did the other institutions, our calendar to accommodate for the fact that our teaching had been disrupted. And of course, getting computers and other support packages to students required some time. So our academic year lasted much longer than it had previously. The University of Pretoria is a well-resourced institution, so we were one of the fortunate ones that completed the 2020 academic year in 2020. But we are still sitting with the situation that our students are not back on campus. The vast majority of our students continue to study from home, and a considerable portion of our staff continue to work remotely as well. And that, of course, has necessitated the creation of new policies making provision for people working from home, new leave policies to deal with situations where people are exposed to COVID-19 but actually are not infected with it, dealing with staff members who cannot perform their duties remotely but also cannot come to the campus because they have comorbidities and such like. So we've had a lot of challenges that have related to the development of new policies and adaptation of old policies. And I'm hearing the words resilience coming through from all of the colleagues who've spoken so far. And I think that that is a theme at our institution as well. Resilience, innovation, flexibility, agility. One of the biggest challenges, I think, has been touched on, and I'm sure you'll be coming to it later, and that is ensuring integrity of assessment with the move to online assessment programs and the proliferation of late of so-called contract cheating opportunities. So I hope that we're actually going to get to perhaps a discussion on those challenges and what we can do at a policy level to protect our institutions on that. But indeed, I would just like to mirror what my colleagues have said to date. I don't think that University of Pretoria's experience is unique in terms of what I've heard now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nicholson. I think all on a sudden we felt a crisis of terminologies, or probably a surge of new terminologies, and we were actually trying to find meanings of that in the changed circumstances. So may I now move on to Professor Gopalan with the same question? How did you find, or how did you find yourself in this nexus, in the density of policies, and on the other side with literally no regulatory help on this?
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, let me begin by thanking my colleagues, Dr. Raj Kumar and Sean Starr, for the kind invitation to be part of such a distinguished panel of colleagues and share some ideas. And in response to your question, yes, you're right. What we, in our situation, and again, when you consider responses or policies and regulations, context is, of course, very, very important, because the regulatory landscape is quite different as our institutional context. And in our particular case, if you recall, in the United States, the White House started with a travel ban imposed on China and travelers from the European Union and the UK initially. And that was met with fierce resistance and anger and opposition. And initial responses from the CDC, NIH, and the White House were quite robust in response to the coronavirus. But thereafter, there was a considerable amount of confusion as to their own response and the response of the states. Because for those who may not be familiar, the US is a very federal regulatory state with a massive competing regulations, both at the state and federal levels, but also with a patchwork of trans-state regulators, including accreditors, which are cross-disciplinary and very discipline-specific accreditors who sometimes transcend states and other times do not. So it makes, I mean, forget the dealing with one regulation or policy, you're dealing with a massive regulations that at any given time could intersect or conflict. And just resolving that conflict alone is the task of many people who are employed full-time on any given day, even without considering an exogenous shock like the COVID pandemic. So the context of the US or running a university in the US makes the challenges in some ways very particular. I won't say difficult, because each country has its own challenges and complexities. But here, because of the unusual federalism and the plurality of regulators, there are very unique challenges that come with regulatory competition, which is unusual even compared to the Western world, right? So I worked in the UK or Australia, Ireland. I mean, they don't have the same degree of regulatory competition to throw a loop into how people who are subject to regulation ought to respond. So that's one thing. So in our case, amidst that confusion from the CDC and the White House and the governors, who, depending on their political identity, had very different responses. I mean, Republican governors reacted very differently to Democrat governors. In our state, which is quite Republican in orientation, but has a Democrat governor, that was an unusual complexity that we had to deal with, right? Where the population itself is actually Republican in orientation, but by a quirk, we have a governor who's a Democrat. So his responses are quite different to what the population here is willing to tolerate or accept. So amidst all of that, what we decided to do was be a bit proactive. And we shut our campus down on March 23rd last year, even before a single case had actually occurred on our campus. And that was different to other institutions in our state, some of whom decided to wait till there was an outbreak and a cluster of cases, et cetera. And they copped a lot of heat for that. I mean, they had to deal with a lot of PR adverse effects with cases coming and anxious parents complaining and so on. So we decided to close our campus before the governor actually issued an order, et cetera. And that really helped us by being one step ahead. Of course, it did not protect us from angry students, because again, the other contextual quirk in the US is that collegiate life is not just about academics. It's also heavily about athletics, right? I mean, the college sport is an industry in itself here. And of course, that dictates a lot of decisions. It dictates a lot of student behavior, and it dictates a lot of finances. So we had to accommodate the quirks of how do you deal with student athletes and the athletics regulations, because they're regulated by different leagues, which have sort of not just normative status, but actual binding status by various compacts and so on. So we had to deal with those responses and the students who are subject to those regulations, because if you shut down a campus, it has enormous consequences on a student athlete's eligibility to play that sport, because there are particular time limits, for example, for how long you can play a sport. You can also not qualify for certain kinds of aid if you're not enrolled and playing that sport during a semester. So there's all kinds of complexities that come with that being another exogenous layer of regulation that is non-academic, but impacts academics that one has to deal with. The other thing that helped us was that on March 23rd, when we closed it, we just had 1 month remaining in that semester. And we already had a very high level of technology adoption. As Dr. Venkatesh mentioned before, we had transitioned almost all of our systems to an online capable, and actually every course was already being offered online as well. So the transition to purely online was not a very difficult transition for us, especially considering that just 4 weeks were remaining in that semester. The bigger challenge for us was what to do after that semester ended. And in that sense, maybe as a segue to further discussion, we decided to use our summer semester, which, as many of you would know, in the States is a smaller enrollment and a smaller set of classes, et cetera, that is offered during the summer when most students go off campus. So we used that summer semester as a kind of trial session to pursue some innovations and adopt some new steps, with a view to sort of incremental change that could survive the longevity of the pandemic. So it really helped us to adopt a more incremental approach, especially with a view to that first closure and then using the summer as a learning opportunity or a sandbox to try new innovations and then give us guidelines for the following academic year. So that's kind of how we responded. And in my own case, I had just been in China a few weeks before we shut down, and I kind of saw the airports close as I was leaving Asia. So I had just arrived back in the country, I think a couple of weeks before we actually closed, and we had seen screenings and so on in some of the Asian airports. And I was quite fortunate not to have been just a week late and been shut out of the country. So I had a sense of relief in that sense in making the decision, being a little bit closer to seeing how it was cascading from Asia towards our borders.
Thank you, Professor Gopalan. In fact, there were some beautiful insights about it that it was not just transitioning to an online forum. It was actually, we were all on a sudden back to Eden. We had to reinvent. We had to recreate the spaces which used to be physical before in these newly given or newly meta geographies. Anyway, let me move with the same question to Professor Knobel before we could have another round of discussion on another aspect of regulation and policy. Professor Knobel, could you respond to the first question?
Yes, well, thank you very much for the invitation. In fact, in Brazil, here where we live, the central decisions and the policies are very centralized within the Ministry of Education. And to tell you the truth, nowadays we are dealing in a very strong political crisis, and there is no response from the federal government to the pandemic. And indeed, on the contrary, there was a denial of the pandemic from the federal government, and this made the complication of the policy regulation even worse. So the approach that most of the universities made was to use the autonomy that we have in principle and by constitution, and try and the best, as many of the previous speakers told. We made similar decisions without any support from a policy, a central policy or government policy or anything. So we decided to do, even knowing that this could have some consequences, but we believe that at the end of the day, everyone will recognize that we are facing a very, very complicated times, a pandemic that never happened before, and the decisions were made to the best of the intent to keep the safety of the students and to keep the safety of the university community. So we decided to do even without any regulation that would allow us to do it, and expecting that in the future, if something happens, this situation will be recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Knobel. I believe all our speakers agree on the fact that this was absolutely a time when our imaginations were tested, and obviously new imaginations were all brought in, but with great success. Now here, I would like to pose my second question, which is more concerning alternative governance, because obviously we have been talking a little, bit more about alternatives of late. So during a time like the pandemic, when conditions no longer remain the same, When all the rules of the game cannot obtain efficient outcomes, institutions go for reimagination and reinvention, as has been the case. However, they happen first at a foundational level, prompting imagination or reimagination of one's identity, sensibilities, approaches, methods, and the reinvention of the very mode of governance itself. Now, two things particularly struck at this point. One is the idea of alternative governance, when the governance itself will become into an alternative, will move into an alternative regime. And the second one is actually alternative ways of governing. That means we retain our present system of governance where we go for policy and strategic innovations. For example, an action plan as an alternative to rules, a statement of disclosure as an alternative to policy explanations, scenario mapping as an alternative to impact assessment, and flexibility as an alternative to rigor and rigidity. What has been your experience in terms of alternative governance? To what extent do you think the alternatives, which today most of us hold dear, can change our systems of governance? I request each speaker actually to take 2 minutes in order to respond to this question, so that I could go for another round of discussion with a third question before we move to the audience questions. Let's go to Professor Luz.
I believe that the massive uses of technology we had experience in UFSB. UFSB is the initials of our university. Even before the pandemic, allowed us to handle this crisis in a less traumatic way. Our university was already experiencing with online classrooms from its very foundation. The UFSB is a pretty new university. We started 7 years ago to have activities here, and so we started with this using of technology, despite of all the structural problems I told before. Was then understood that as a means to reach relatively distant populations, this use of technologies without access to public superior education. We are in a region that has a lot of people that don't have access to public superior education, so we started using the technology to reach those people. This significantly facilitated our institutional adaptation to this new situation. But I used to say that the university is at the same time innovative and conservative. There was, and there still is, an enormous resistance regarding changes in the way you used to do things. But I don't believe that we can go back where we were before. The pandemic forced a change to virtual space, which was already expected. Obviously, there is the need to discuss and reflect all the aspects of this virtual global education experience. But there is no denying that many of those changes are here to stay. And at the same time, universities institutionally practice the regulation. The pandemic forced us to out of this world of this somehow what the unthinking protocolar practice, making us have to deal with new unanticipated problems. I believe these experiences brings out the best side of our institutions, our very vocation with this critical permanent problem solving disposition to handle the most pressing issues of the world. So I believe that these experiences will put us in another place, in another way of thinking our university. Of course, this will impact a lot what we have to do, we will do in the next years, in the future, I mean. So that's it.
I think the language of alternatives, which we have been using since 90s, so we have been quite accustomed to that. And obviously, surprise is nothing new for humanity. Ever since we have moved into the post-modernity, that we have been getting one surprise after another, and we have developed this amazing capability of resilience in this modern world, which obviously helped us even during this time as well. So I would like to move now to General Venkatesh with the same question. Did you opt for an alternative governance or alternative means within the existing system of governance?
Yeah, I think I like the terminology that you have brought in, the alternative means of within the existing system. I think that is what we adapted to. Because, the Indian governance system is pretty rigid, and there were regulations that need to be followed, the periodicity of meetings, the periodicity of recording, periodicity of various, academic bodies. All those issues had to be adhered to in full. But then this was not possible during the times of this COVID situation. Therefore, we went into alternative ways of governance. and successfully utilize the technology for, for holding on these meetings. Of course, not in the same periodicity as was described in the original listing, but yet we made, or wherever the deviation was, we made from the original governance structure or governance decision, we went back to the governing body at a later date and got them ratified. Therefore, you use the flexibility and the confidence with the governance structure had in the day-to-day administration of the university to the fullest. And of course, everybody understood that there was a need for us to move away the capital expenditure, the revenue expenditure, the resource allocation, the rules and regulations governing human resource management. Everything had to be changed to an extent to suit the requirements at that particular time. So a lot of things changed. And I suspect that this will reflect in the way we govern ourselves as we go forward. And I'm sure our registry structure will become more flexible, and many things which has worked during the pandemic will become the new norm as we go forward. I think I would end at this stage.
Yeah, thank you, General Venkatesh. Professor Nicholson?
We also didn't move to an alternate form of governance. Our governance structures are dictated by the Higher Education Act, which is the regulatory framework within which the public universities operate. But we also harnessed the technology. We moved our meetings online. It gave us amount of agility in terms of setting up extra meetings in order to address pressing problems. It allowed for thorough participation and discussion of issues as and when they arose. So we as the others did, also made use of alternate means of governance. What our universities, again, is with a process of reimagining the university for the future. Because I agree with my colleagues, I don't think that there's any possibility that in South Africa, universities will resort to the status quo ante and just simply go back to how things were. We are going to see what of the changes that were accelerated pandemic will benefit us going forward, and what of the old structures and the old processes and so on will benefit us, and try and marry the two to offer an improved university going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gopalan. Thank you, Professor Nicholson. Professor Gopalan.
Thank you, Sreejith. I mean, that's a massive and a very good question that you posed. But of course, I'm struggling as to whether I should respond to it as a legal academic or as a VC type person. So I'll try to be the administrator and not the academic. And in responding to it, the colleagues who've spoken before me have done a great job of describing the internal governance, internal organizational governance elements of how things have changed or not. So I'll focus more on the outward touching parts of alternative governance, just to give a little bit fuller picture. So take one example, which is the public safety and health of students, right? And normally the safety and health is a subject matter for governance and regulation for either the federal government and its agencies or the state government. I mean, that's true in most countries, including the United States. So what do you do when either the federal government or the state government, which occupies the domain of making regulations and governance standards, does not do anything? Should universities step into the void and seek to provide an alternative form of governance, because safety and health, of course, directly impact a university's operations? That's a very challenging question. And many universities here have kind of tried to step into that void and fill it with some kind of alternative model of governance. And to be very specific, what I'm talking about here is the upcoming reopening of our fall semesters. In our own case, that's coming up in mid-August, and for most universities in this country, it's August or September. So what has happened here over the last summer, summer, has been a proliferation of vaccination mandates by universities, which have said to their students coming onto campus next month that if you don't have a vaccination and cannot prove it, you cannot come onto campus. This is a clear case of an alternative form of governance, because the state has not mandated it, nor has the federal government. Right? The government could have easily said, if you want to qualify for federal financial aid, you need to prove vaccination status if you have to be on campus. Similarly, the states could have said, if you want to qualify for certain grants and so on, or if the university has to operate as an entity, you need to prove vaccination status for all people who are on your campus. Neither entity has said so. Universities, on the other hand, have stepped in to varying degrees and said you've got to prove vaccination status, 1, to attend classes, and 2, certainly to live in our dorms. Some have even started kicking out or de-enrolling students who have not produced that proof. So what do you think has been the response? It's a massive outcry. In some campuses, even in our own state, there are student protests, marches against the vaccination mandates. In other places, students have withdrawn from those universities and transferred to others. In other cases, students have commenced class action lawsuits against those universities saying you cannot mandate this kind of vaccination requirement. There have been challenges based on religious freedom, on autonomy, on liberty, you name it, equality, all kinds of grounds. And of course, the other response to the alternative governance that the universities have adopted has been a conflicting governance or regulation by the state governors and state legislatures, which have now started passing laws in the state legislature prohibiting universities from requiring vaccination. So it's an amazing study, if you're a scholar of alternative modes of governance, as to what can happen, right? Because there's a law passed by the Florida legislature, there's a law passed by Ohio, I think just recently, and there's a bill currently pending in North Carolina, which expressly prohibit universities from denying access to education based on vaccination status. So it just tells you, I think, and for the reason why we did not adopt a mandate is because we thought it's a dangerous place to be, and it is trying to do too much, because the university is not the public health official in either the area, much less the limited zip codes that it occupies. That is preempted and expressly allocated to either the state or the federal government. So if a university tries to do too much, the risk of being caught in the middle is too high. So we've been very cautious in not requiring such a mandate.
Thank you, Professor Gopalan. There's a very interesting insight there that no matter how much an institution wants to be imaginative in terms of new governance, it's actually the policy and the regulatory ecosystem which will ultimately decide whether to go for alternative governance or alternative means within the existing form of governance. Professor Knobel, I would like to hear your views on the same.
Yes, indeed, the same issue that happened before, that I mentioned before, the regulation and the state, and here in Brazil we have the state as similar to the United States, the state and the federal government in a different roles, and there is a mess regarding the political polarization and disputes and everything related to vaccination and everything. So and now we are keeping our pace and trying to do the best. So in our example here, in the state of São Paulo, for example, the governor and the Secretary of Education made mandatory to return to online to presential face-to-face classes in the next semester, and we are not following that rule. So this is probably going to have an implication on a dispute. But in any case, we have to think about our community, our students, our faculty, and until more or less the decision here is everyone is vaccinated, we will not return to the full presential campus. So this is something that we have to face. And on the other hand, the governance, internal governance in terms of rules, we have usually a very rigid system in terms of grades, in terms of possibilities for students to apply for a course, for a class, and we made a flexible decision to flexibilize everything. So this is something that we decided in our campuses, and we are dealing with that. So the internal governance was kept with a lot of flexibilization on the rules and waiting for the best response from the society, from the students, from the faculty, and from everyone that depends on the university.
Thank you, Professor Knobel. I'll ask one more question before we move to the audience. I request the distinguished speakers actually to limit your answers to 1 minute. This is actually a question that pertains to the future. That's about this new discourse of the new normal. So during the pandemic, many institutions reimagined and reinvented their institutional policies to meet the needs of the pandemic times. Indeed, institutions thought imaginatively and acted innovatively. They dared to experiment with success. However, in that all these were desirable responses to the perils of the pandemic that legitimized all these actions. The immateriality of legitimacy perhaps has also prompted the institutions to act free from fear of regulatory breaches or from becoming deviant, which will happen sooner than later. Once the regulations return, once legitimacy comes back to haunt our actions, how can institutions continue to retain successful practices adopted during the pandemic? How effective could be this idea of the new normal in helping institutions in reclaiming their willing and acting during the times of the pandemic? Professor Luce.
Well, I think that are at least two issues I'd like to highlight here. The first concerning the relationship between the university and the society, and the second concerning the teaching and learning process within our universities. On the first issue, the pandemic has placed us in a situation where we need a much closer dialogue with different sectors of civil society, public authorities, companies, several communities, etc. But this was needed because public universities in Brazil responded quickly to the crisis, and in many work fronts, university hospitals were made available to take care of people affected by the COVID. Many of our researchers were involved in all sorts of researches, and we also worked very hard to keep the population well informed in different communication channels. And last but not least, we are also had many members of our community involved in helping people in condition of social vulnerability. All this brought our institution much closer to the society at large. I believe this approximation needs to continue. On the second issue, one of the main objectives of our universities, from teaching point of view, is to train professionals able to understand and intervene in the social reality, transforming it into scientifically based, technically adequate, and socially significant actions. So we know there is a distinction between the content theoretical tools provided by a formal education and its application on a professional capacity. So education should strive then to develop students' abilities to characterize social reality and derive it from available knowledge and technology, professional and personal behavior that increase the quality and effectiveness of their interventions. Based on these assumptions, I believe that the changes brought by the COVID pandemic offer a window of opportunity to reflect on our educational teaching learning concepts. Maybe it will become more and more important to move away from traditional educational model centered on the institutional transfer of content to a free and much open experimental model, centering students, their distinctive realities and their active involvement in the learning process. Okay?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Luce. General Venkatesh?
Yes, I think many of the lessons learned or whatever we have been achieved during the pandemic period are there to stay. That's something that I personally feel, though one would look at having the students back on campus, brick and mortar campus university way of delivering education will be one of the ways of delivering. I suspect that the blended model will become more and more prevalent. And within I'm sure the regulators are already, are being quite conscious of it. And the government policies are quite conscious of it. And the new national education policy also reflects this particular aspect in more than one way. I think university will have to look at risk mitigation strategies to face such unprecedented situations. I think we've already had some experience, therefore this will become a new norm. And also look at disruptions with pandemic-like situations or any other natural calamities and various other things. We have to work towards providing a seamless learning experience to students. Therefore, there is no escaping in investment to technology, to bring in more smart classrooms, remote virtual laboratory facilities, newer e-content development programs, perhaps learning management systems which are far more student-friendly and faculty-friendly. And more importantly, we need to invest very heavily on teacher training and faculty development programs with regard to a shift over from conventional educations to technology-enabled education. And as a university, which are not-for-profit universities, as all universities are in India, we need to really look at our financial policies and priorities with regard to financial allocations over after having experienced this pandemic. We need to build on more student support system and more interactive systems with the parents and other stakeholders within the university. Really the response of the regulators, those two in the initial part of it, I think they are now awake and they are awake to the situation. And I'm sure they're going to make provisions, change the regulations to an extent that they're going to support this endeavors of the universities as we go forward. And the governmental policies also with regard to higher education and provision of healthcare are going to change, and more impetus will be given to these changes. And this homogenization of all three regulators, the universities and the governmental systems, and I'm sure there is a distinct change. Many of the changes are going to stay, and the regulations will have to change in that regard.
I think that's a very refreshing picture that regulators have started to take stock of the regulations and also the various innovations done by the universities. There is a sort of receptivity now on the side of the regulators to understand how universities reacted. I'm sure that gives us a lot of hope. Let me now move to Professor Nicholson. And again, my apologies to request you to limit the your talk to a minute, please.
Sure. As I said to you previously, we've also made the decision already that we won't be returning to the precise situation that we were in before the pandemic struck. The university does have a well-developed institutional business continuity plan, and as one of the previous speakers had already indicated, this has actually been a wonderful opportunity for us to test that plan. So that's something that we need to develop further, given the indications that although this is the first pandemic that struck us, it's highly unlikely that it will be the last. We were already in a hybrid teaching model when the pandemic struck, so we made a relatively easy transition to the sort of bisynchronous online presentation of our programs. But of course, some of the issues around integrity of processes, etc., have caused us to pause and take a very close look at what we're doing to ensure that we don't ever compromise the integrity of the qualifications and programs that we offer. And that may give rise to significant changes in the policies that we have applicable, particularly in the areas of examinations, tests, and other forms of assessment. We also have close with our community, and in fact, the university has served the community very closely throughout the pandemic, and I do believe that our relationship with the community has grown closer over the time, as has been the experience of other contributors today. But I do think that this is also something that we will need to maintain. I think the role of a university as part of a community and in service to the community is going to become a theme that will apply going forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nicholson. Professor Gopalan?
Thank you. Again, just to be very brief, without the kind of a possession of a crystal ball, my guesstimate is that there will be many new normals rather than just one new normal in the future. And the normal will be variable depending on where you are and what part of the university or higher education landscape you occupy. Again, this is not the first exogenous shock that has hit higher education. Right? 2007, 2008, the financial crisis, at least for the US, UK, Australia, etc., was a kind of off the cliff kind of moment where drastic changes occurred, and many of them persisted until today. I mean, the greater focus on student outcomes, the online adoption, etc., all started there, and they've survived. So from that, if you take the idea that the online education model is kind of much more normalized, and if the university's job is to provide online education and skills through online modalities, one of the realities is that there are people who are better placed to provide online skills than universities. Right? For example, Google and Amazon can provide online education in AI and digital marketing and whatnot better than any university can. And in fact, what we will probably see is a proliferation of industry credentials and certifications, which supplant or displace university qualifications. We already have that in the US. Now, already the big employers have said college degrees are optional. You don't need a degree to go to work for Google or Amazon or IBM. They provide their own certifications, they provide their own training. The question is how much of this will proliferate beyond the IT, marketing, those kinds of disciplines to become more normalized in other areas. Secondly, I think is the case of regulatory overreach and rigidity truly gone, or is it likely to creep back to previous days? We've seen, despite shocks in the past, every time there is a window of opportunity and hope that regulators will be more principles-based and outcome-based rather than rule-based, it seems to slip right back to the old ways. So I'm not very optimistic that the regulatory community will truly embrace outcome-based regulation or principles-based regulation. So we're more likely, once memory fades, to get back to the same kinds of rigidity. One hopes that that is not the case, but that would be one of the most crucial pieces of learning that I hope that they take from it, because otherwise, it's not just universities or colleges that become redundant. Regulators will also become redundant.
Thank you, Professor Gopalan. That's a very interesting insight. Professor Knobel?
Well, I know that we are late already, so I will be really quick. Well, I believe from the future, I know that is an exercise of futurology that is really hard to say, but I would say that probably, in my opinion, I am a little bit more pessimistic. I would say that we will return to the usual way. I would say that we will try to forget as much as possible of this period of pandemic, and the situation will return as much as we had before the pandemic. But I hope that the good lessons and the good practices that we learned during this period will be kept forever.
Thank you, Professor Knobel. Thank you so much. We have, yes, exceeded the time, but I'll still take a couple of questions from the audience. We have received a very interesting set of questions, of which the first one, of course, any one of you may take this question. It's about what exactly is the role of students in reimagining policies and regulations? What extent of democratic participation would be given to them in this? Anyone can take the question. Yes, Professor Luz, please.
No, I think as Professor Knobel talked, I think that for our students specifically, I think that what they expected is we guide I don't know if they have this not compromise, but they in Brazil, I don't know if Dr. Knobel agrees with me, but we have our universities are organized in terms of academic and administrative structure with the participation of members of our community, including the students and the outside people from society. So we discuss a lot our policies and our regulations with the students, and I believe that would be very interesting for us to have this background from them about what impacted how this issue, the regulations we made and the work we did during this time would affect them. And so I think that this would be very interesting to have a background, a feedback, I mean, from them. And we are working on it, and we have worked with our students to have the feedback to know if what we did is actually the best way of dealing with their problems, with their expectations, and so on. So I think that this would be like a pathway to follow now. Okay.
One last question I'll take from the students. It's actually that we have now found that the online teaching has its own share of success. Can we think about retaining that permanently and continue with a hybrid mode of education? Any one of you may take the question. Yes, General Venkatesh, yes.
I think a very good question. I personally feel that when we are entering from school to the university, I think brick and mortar universities will really be a real important, in the sense that campus-based education will have its role. Perhaps online education will be at a slightly higher level. And important thing is that it's not just about the delivery of academic knowledge. It's also about developing skills, developing interpersonal relationship, teamwork, communication skills, working as a team, working as a group, and more importantly, peer learning and learning outside of your classroom within the university. I think as a as an academician, I mean, an old-time academician, I would think that for a graduate education, somebody who's aspiring to be a basic graduation, this continues to be important. It will continue to be important. And perhaps at a later level, maybe at the master's level, and at for additional qualifications, the blended mode of education and purely on-site education will be of very, very important value. This is my thoughts briefly on this.
Thank you.
question.
Thank you, General. Yeah. Thank you so much. I wish this conversation continued, but obviously we are already 6 minutes beyond the permitted time. I have to end this conversation here. I take this opportunity to thank each one of you for your insights. You displayed confidence, you displayed optimism, and definitely there is hope in what you have provided. I'm sure that we'll have a better tomorrow with you people at the helm of affairs. For our audience, please stay tuned. This session has come to an end. However, our next session, the 27th technical session, which is on holistic higher education, role of interdisciplinary studies in overcoming challenges of the 21st century, will start in the next 10 minutes. Please stay tuned or rejoin us in through our YouTube link in the next 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you and good evening and good night.